Thank you, Brendan. Yeah, so the question mark is very key to the presentation. Essentially, I'm trying to argue that, in fact, these were not deadbeat dads. But many married men in the 18th century British Army were seen as deadbeat dads. And to illustrate my point, I show you a painting by a very renowned 18th century British artist by the name of William Hogarth. This painting is called The March of the Guards to Finchley. And in the almost center foreground of the painting, you can see a grenadier with literally two women, or a girl on each arm, you might say. And one of them is very clearly pregnant. This painting is depicting a somewhat fictionalized event when the army was called upon to go north and to defeat the Jacobite uprising in Scotland. And so this is a departure of troops. And if you look off to the far left, you can see a drummer here with the image isn't coming up as well as I'd like, but with red hair. And down here, beside the drummer, is a little red-haired boy who is clearly meant to be his son, who is pulling at the drummer, and of course the drummer isn't really focused at all on his son or his wife, presumably, who's also kind of pulling at him. And then on the other side of the picture, on the far right, you see another kind of quintessential image of 18th century soldiers. This is the drunk guy off in the corner there, pulling at the gin cellar, trying to get more, and his comrade is helping him drink a little more. But all of this is to kind of show a prevailing perception in the 18th century of soldiers as essentially womanizing, profligate, not responsible husbands and fathers. This image has been perpetuated in the literature of the time as well. I have a couple of examples for you, but they're just the tip of the iceberg. There's a 1723 poem by Edward Ward that has the line, "The soldier leaves his children and his wife for the loose pleasures of a wretched life." In other words, the soldier is, a married man is enlisting in order to get away from his kids and his wife. At the end of the century, near the end of the long 18th century, which goes into the 19th century, there's a novel by Charlotte Smith by the name of Marchmont, which has a scene a very poignant scene of a sickly wife with an infant and three, as she says, naked, half-starved children in a cottage. And they had been abandoned by a father who had run away and enlisted in the army because, quote, he could no longer bear to see their misery. So this is kind of another side to it, but it's still perpetuating the idea that enlistment was a way to get away from your family and just leave those responsibilities. Perhaps the most infamous example is a comedy called The Recruiting Officer by George Farquhar, which first premiered in 1706. And it begins with the scene of an army recruiting officer saying, everyone who has too much wife, join the army. So, and escape from brats and wives, as it says. So recruiting was also supposed to be going towards the idea that this is a way to get away from your family and never have to deal with them again and never have to provide for them again. And there are many, many examples of this perception in the 18th century. But the point is clear, that essentially any married man who enlisted must have done so to leave his family and to abscond from his responsibilities to provide for them. And there are real reasons for this perception. Soldiers were notoriously poorly paid. British infantrymen in the long 18th century made about 8 pennies a day. after stoppages from his pay, etc., because his pay would be stopped to pay for his uniform and things like that. This is less than even the lowest laborer in civilian society, who would make about 10 pennies a day. So there's no way that a soldier could be seen to realistically be able to provide for a family. Historians have essentially accepted this image of the married soldier as a deadbeat dad. Keith Snell, one of the leading historians of the poor in the long 18th century, wrote in 1985 in his book, "Enlistment was the institutionally acceptable form of familial desertion." In other words, for plebeian men, they couldn't go to Parliament and get an official separation, and if they left their wives, the parish would come after them to provide maintenance for their family. But if they enlisted, the parish would not be able to, first of all, find them. But even if the parish did locate a runaway husband, if he was in uniform, the parish could not legally compel him to provide for his family because of legislation that I won't go into right now. But they were kind of a protected group. So it makes sense that historians have agreed that they were deadbeat dads. The most focused study on military men and enlistment as marital desertion came out in 1990. This is an article by David Kent called "Gone for a Soldier" that talks about how soldiers would enlist to desert their families. David Kent looked at parish poor relief records to make his conclusions. Poor relief is actually a form of welfare in the 18th century, that in England, the paupers of the parish could come to the overseers of the poor, these officials within the parish, and actually plead poverty and collect a small pension from the parish that was like welfare. There were various strictures on who could receive these payments. Among them being whether you had a settlement in the parish, so whether you'd lived or worked in the parish or paid rent in the parish for a particular amount of time. But another important criteria was that you had need. So, deserted wives would claim that they needed parish relief because their husband had left them. And David Kent looked at all of these claims for parish relief and discovered a lot of women claiming that their husbands had enlisted and gone from them. And so he used these records to argue that there is quantifiable evidence that enlistment was an important form of marital desertion. So Kent's observations have essentially been wholeheartedly accepted by subsequent histories of marriage and histories of the British Army. So I just have a couple up here, but the key work on divorce in the long 18th century is a book called Broken Lives by Lawrence Stone. Joanne Bailey, her book called Unquiet Lives on Marriage in the Long 18th Century came out in 2003, and Stephen Conway's War, State, and Society that came out in 2006. All of these scholars and many more use David Kent's findings to argue unequivocally that enlistment was the way that married men got out of their marital responsibilities. I would like to present a different possibility, and that is, I went back to, pardon me, I'll go back to David Kent. I went back to David Kent's records, these parish relief records, and I read through thousands of parish relief requests and looked particularly at those from on the part of military wives who asked the parish for relief. Almost all of these state simply that their husband was serving abroad in a particular regiment. They offer details of the regiment and their husband's likely location. Kent has seen these as deserted wives. I would argue instead that they are not, and that in fact we need to look at these women in the context of military and poor relief policies of the time. So my thesis is instead that these soldiers did not leave their wives to abandon them, but rather to help provide for their families. That these men actually had a family survival strategy in mind. One of the reasons that I propose this is because at times of war, where we particularly see married men enlisting, the terms of service change. During wartime, soldiers ordinarily, infantrymen ordinarily, would pretty much enlist for life. But when the army really needed men during times of war, they would change those stipulations. They would offer an enlistment agreement that stipulated that the soldier was only in the British Army for 6 years or the duration of the war. So there's shorter terms of service. This might attract a married man. He's not necessarily leaving his family forever. They also would offer bigger bounties. So bounty is, of course, a way of attracting soldiers to enlist. So there were subscriptions that would be taken up in local communities that would inflate the bounty money that the Army could offer potential recruits. In 1796, this bounty in London that was offered to soldiers in the regular Army was as high as £21 per man. That is huge. That is a year and a half's wages for a laborer at the time. So this would be a very appealing financial incentive to even a married man to enlist. And it's very difficult to find traces of the history of plebeian men and women, but I was able to find a few indications that these men would actually give the bounty money to their wife before they left. The other important reason that I think we should rethink our understanding of married soldiers as deadbeat dads is that many of these married men may have enlisted believing they could bring their wives with them, and that in fact it was the Army that separated the couple. So they may have thought, and recruiters may have told them, that they could bring their wife along as a camp follower, because of course many of you may already know, in the 18th and early 19th century, women, a certain number of women, could travel with the Army during a campaign on the strength of the Army. In other words, they would be allowed to receive half rations along with their soldiers in return for doing services such as laundry, cooking, that sort of thing. And this is an image by Cruikshank near the end of the 18th century called Soldiers on a March. And you can see that there's a significant component of women here. But this is actually a caricature. It shows, in a sense, the Army's perspective. They didn't actually want very many women traveling with the troops. You can see here, the women are almost depicted as literally a burden on a campaigning army. You know, the soldier over here on the left, near the left side of the image, is carrying his wife. There's a kettle on the end of his musket, and you know, this is not a good combat-ready image of an army. So the army actually stopped a lot of spouses from coming along on campaign. Increasingly, they made use of what they called the ticketing system, whereby as the army's about to embark on campaign, wives would have to draw lots to see who would get to come. And the officers would make the numbers very small. And there's a lot of heart-wrenching accounts of these drawing of lots that would occur at the quayside before a campaign. And the autobiographies that cover these accounts are mostly concentrated in the early 19th century. So I have one that's published in 1829 that recounts a young wife who drew a not-to-go ticket and displayed such grief, and I'm going to read it now, that Few men who witnessed it could keep a dry eye. She and her husband stayed up together the entire night before his departure, alternately embracing one another and the small child who lay between them. Like many other accounts, this wife also begged of the commanding officer on her knees that she not be left behind. Fighting back tears himself, the officer is reported to have said, "I feel for you much, but my orders are peremptory that no more than 6 women to each 100 men go with their husbands. You have had your chance as well as the other women. There are many more in the same predicament, and it is totally out of my power to help it." "Well, well," said she, rising from her knees and straining her infant to her breast. "It's o'er with us, my poor baby. This day leaves us friendless on the wide, wide world." So this kind of shows a different perspective that, in fact, it's the army that's pushing these families apart rather than the, carefree husband. The other point that I want to make, though, is whether indeed this woman who was left behind was entirely friendless on the wide, wide world. I don't want to overstress the point that the army forced families apart. In some cases, couples may have chosen to separate after the husband's enlistment. That in fact, enlistment may have been part of a family survival strategy. There's a very well-known British historian at the University of Newcastle by the name of Jeremy Bolton, who has done some really interesting work that talks about pauper family survival strategies, that they would farm out their children on relatives and friends in order to better survive. And Bolton argues that these strategies are survival strategies. We shouldn't be taking them as a sign that the poor people didn't love their children, that poorer people didn't have as much family sentiment, but instead that they had, very pragmatic considerations governing their actions. And so I would add to Jeremy Bolton's work that enlistment was another family survival strategy. It would, in fact, improve the family's chances of accessing parish relief. The parish wouldn't ordinarily give money to a household that had an able-bodied man living at home. So if a family was very impoverished, they couldn't get relief because there is a guy at home who can conceivably work. So when the army recruiting parties came around, it might seem appealing to such an able-bodied man who would qualify for a soldier to leave his family but still provide them with at least the bounty money. And after he left, and this is key, the wife would have better access to this welfare system. And these are the women, I would argue, that we see in these parish relief records. They're women whose husbands left, letting them know where he was going, and tried to keep contact in some way. And then that would have allowed the wife to then go to the parish and actually get relief. Because, in fact, as a military wife, she kind of advanced into a special category of the deserving poor. These women were actually given kind of special status in the parish relief system. And I've actually found accounts of women pretending that they were soldiers' wives in order to access some of these benefits because it was so lucrative. So in summary, all of this points to the fact that married men enlisted as a result of a much greater variety of considerations. And escaping his wife was probably further down on the list than historians have hitherto believed. In sum, married soldiers were not necessarily deadbeat dads. They may have been told or assumed that their enlistment would not separate them from their wives. They may have at least held to a hope that their wife would be among the fortunate few allowed to travel on the strength of the army. Alternatively, husbands and wives may have decided that his separation from the family was a worthwhile step to allow wives and children more certain access to parish relief while husbands were provided for by the army. We definitely cannot assume that contemporaries and historians' depictions of soldiers as these wild, womanizing ne'er-do-wells is an entirely accurate picture. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Michael, how much press ganging went on at this time? How many of the people in the army would have been forcibly enlisted?
That's a good question, Michael. There was a land press, but the lion's share of our kind of negative perception of the press gang really comes from the naval press, the sea press. So what I actually do in another part of my current book project is I look at wives' role in recruitment in the army. And I actually argue that when we look at land impressment, we can see wives influencing their husbands when there's a press gang around and their husbands are so destitute that they're possibly fodder for these press gangs, because the press gangs didn't impress everyone. They only impressed those men who were kind of called lewd and lazy and, you know, who weren't following any clear occupation. So if you were a man that was that poor, your wife probably would have pushed you to volunteer, and you wouldn't have really gotten pressed. In fact, the only pressed husbands that I can find are at the very start of the 18th century, and then they disappear. And yet you still see a significant number of married men enlisting. So my hypothesis is that wives are actually pushing their husbands to enlist.
Was there a difference between town and country where this is concerned? Because the 18th century is, we call it enclosure has already started to a degree, but 80% of the population or 85 is rural still. But would there have been a difference, substantial difference in all of these considerations you're talking about between the countryside and the cities?
That's a really good question, Michael, because my work focuses on London. Right. I can't say in my own work that I have found distinct differences. A lot of recruitment happens in London simply because that's where the men are to be found. So yeah, I can't say that I've seen really dramatic differences between town and country, though.
I suspect that the naval press gangs were concentrated in the ports, the port cities.
Yes, well, yes, exactly. Pretty much all naval impressment happened
they were looking for seamen, right?
Because they were supposed to be men who followed a seafaring trade. That's right. Although it was a very elastic definition.
They take men.
Yeah, they pretty much took anybody. But yeah, you're right. And so impressment for the Navy would happen in port towns, right, whereas for the Army, in theory, it could happen anywhere. But you really see it mostly around London. And people are so opposed to impressment that the land press is actually legislated out by the I think it's the early 1780s. But the sea press, they need sailors so badly that they just keep doing it. Yeah.
Look at the role of France.
Was there any way in which soldiers' wages, there's only 6 pennies a day, they could be sent to the wife? And was there any chance that once a soldier enlisted that he would be able to go home and see the wife, or was he gone forever? And what happens when he's killed?
Excellent questions all. Okay, the wage was actually 8 pennies a day, not that it would make a significant difference, but yeah, that's something that I have found in my own work that no one else has seen, is that there was no official Army-wide policy allowing soldiers to pass on their wages to their wives. Sailors, on the other hand, they made more money because they were a more valuable labor commodity, because they were skilled. So sailors had a wage allocation system that they could name any dependent, and that dependent would go to the local Navy office and collect a portion of their partner or friend or son wages. Soldiers, there was nothing like that throughout the long 18th century. But I have found evidence in officers' letters that individual regiments might offer their men a way to pass on their wages to their wives. And it was, interestingly, through these officers' wives back home. In my example, I see in London, an officer wrote his wife, gave the information of his soldier and how much money would be allocated to her, and the wife actually passed it on. These soldiers' wives would come to her home and she'd give them some money. And he liked it because it stopped his men from spending all their money on prostitutes and drink. So not that they would have had much to spend. And your last question is about how they would ever be able to visit their spouses, and that's really interesting too, because it's really difficult to find traces of these people. Like, you know, private soldiers in the infantry they're barely literate with no money, so it's really hard to find letters or anything like that. But in court records, you can actually see if the soldier was stationed somewhere in England, they would get furloughs and go home and see their wives. You also see in the court records, sometimes a witness might say, my mom just got back from the Isle of Wight where she was visiting my dad. You know, so there were ways that these partnerships still kind of retain some tenuous connections. But they're really difficult to find, and until now, no historian has argued that really anyone stayed together after they enlisted, if they didn't go as a camp follower. But I feel like they tried. Sure.
I feel like I have about 73 questions that might only interest me. I'm sort of fascinated by the way in which the construction of the deadbeat dad depends on a certain construction of perhaps the shrewish woman. You know, that she's so awful that you have to leave. It's a good idea to leave.
Yes, that's an interesting, yeah.
And so in this picture, what I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about perhaps is one sort of more physically astounding nature of the women in this picture. That they look almost like men in drag.
Yeah.
But also how there are women, certainly on the right-hand side, carrying a soldier. And then if I'm not mistaken, perhaps indistinguishable, the person who's carrying the teapot on the bayonet, is that a soldier or a woman, and who's carrying who?
Yeah.
And perhaps that confusion is...
Okay, I will not be able to answer that part of the question because I really don't.
I guess if you talk a little bit more about the picture,
Yes, yeah. Well, I'm glad because I never know how much time I'm going to have, so I kind of. But what I find interesting, because nobody's really interpreted this caricature that I can find.
Yeah.
This one is held in the collection of the National Army Museum, and they just give the artist and the date basically. But I would argue, as I said, that it's a commentary on the burden of the women who travel with the troops. And I think, just to answer briefly the first point that you made, which I think is really interesting and maybe hasn't completely entered my my perspective on things, which it will now. But I definitely think there is kind of a dual perception of soldiers' wives. The ones who travel with the troops are often seen as the absolute lowest forms of femininity. They're really not seen as feminine at all. And increasingly, I argue, in the 18th century, because women weren't needed by the army, because they had sufficient supply lines, they didn't need women to go out foraging for food. They actually they wanted to discourage women from even wanting to travel with the troops. And the Enlightenment ideas of femininity, too, at the time, kind of argue that that's not an appropriate space for a woman to be. Any respecting woman, self-respecting woman, would not be seen in this environment. So there's the camp followers who are almost men, and their morality is questionable. And then there's the wives who stayed behind, who are the more appropriate feminine figures. And I kind of argue that it's here where we see the start of the idea of a home front, which a lot of us focus on the First World War as that. But just to quickly address the other point that, or your question about the picture, this is the officer who I would argue is being presented as extremely effeminate, riding on the back of a very buxom woman, and it's his poor management that has caused the troops to be so laden with women and children, and that it's the officers who need to, man up and do those difficult things at the quayside and say, you can't come, sorry, the parish will look after you. So this is what I think this image is a commentary on. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much.